All right, everyone, welcome back. This is going to be the final piece of chapter 8 in the book or lecture 5 in the series. And this is going to be about rentier economies or rent seeking economies. They try and do a fairly poor job of differentiating extraction and rentier economies in the book. I'm not even going to really bother with it. There are differences, but let's just stick to the core concepts. For the most part, extractive and raunchy economies sort of work exactly the same. There's just differences in how they sort of develop the industries and collect rents and these sorts of things. But anyway, more important than this, than sort of the differentiation or whatever, are the problems of extractive economies or the resource curse, whatever. The resource curse is a little bit different again than the Dutch disease. So we'll focus on Dutch disease because resource curse is a little broader than this. I would say it includes the Dutch disease as one of the sub issues, right? All right, Dutch disease is the idea that when you have one sort of exploding economic interest or one sector that's drawing all the profits or only one industry that sort of dominates an economy, right? That this can cause problems in the broader economy because the best labor and basically all labor, but they get to be very choosy because they have what's called a monopsony. But all labor starts to flood into that sector or that industry or business. You start to see much of investment from the country flood into that business, as in a sense we are starting to see with like AI in some even industrialized countries. Um, and you also get more sort of support from government for that industry, right? And this can cause a lot of problems like inflation, um, because the demand for that product or resource or whatever it might be is very high. It's pushing up the value of a currency, but this sort of washes out the rest of the society's purchasing power outside of that sector, right? And so the more sort of focused you are on a singular sector, the more problems it can be, from labor problems to competitiveness to inflation. And as this gets worse and worse, the state actually gains power because it's far simpler to control a singular economic sector than a highly diverse and spread and powerful set of sectors, right? Another problem with this approach, the Rentier approach or the extractive approach, is they are highly influenced by commodity swings, right? And so we're seeing this right now with the Iran war. The sort of producers of petroleum products and fertilizers in particular are becoming, it's strengthening them, right? It's strengthening um, their profit margins. And so Iran is becoming more powerful. China, who is a rising domestic producer, is becoming more powerful. Russia, who depends on the petrostate, becoming more powerful. And then arguably the US, who has in the last 20 years become, shifted from a net importer to a net exporter and um, even more and more of a net exporter over time. But these commodity prices they can wreak real havoc. We talked about Venezuela and how things were going well under Maduro for the first couple of years because petroleum prices were, $85 to $105 at sort of the beginning, right? And then they just started to collapse further and further over time. And these projects that he wanted to implement had less and less funding. There was, graft and corruption. The nepotism meant that like the petroleum companies weren't being run by experts, so they all deteriorated. These things caused some pretty severe problems. Let's see. I would point out that in the modern era, especially countries like we talked about, I think the first one from Lecture 5 is the Saudis and Oman and states like the UAE trying to diversify further, right? Instead of actually diversifying their economy to, a broad, diversified, number of sectors. Instead, they're just going to focus on petro products and sort of the what is it called, the sovereign wealth fund, right? The Saudi Arabian sovereign wealth fund, and diversifying their assets and their holdings, right, across a whole bunch of different industries, and then paying out a whole bunch of different like corruption bribes and these sorts of things. And so they are becoming more and more powerful and more able to weather the influence of these commodity swings where other states have not been able to. Okay, let's see. What are the major consequences of this Rentier or extractive approach? We're getting into sort of the resource curse problems here again. The first is citizen rights, right? And this is going to be slide 7 or 8, the mostly like blue map, Rentier states and their consequences. And these data come from the VDEM project, Variants of Democracy, I think it's called. I use some of this data actually in my dissertation. And this particular measure that they're sort of mapping out here is based on things like government torture, whether you can be, whether political killings happening in your country, forced labor, which is pretty popular in the area we're talking about. Um, Property right institutions and laws about property rights, which tend to be pretty weak in the Middle East. And then freedoms, your sort of basic, I don't know, what would it be like? Bill of Rights, right? So freedom of religion, freedom of expression and speech, freedom of association. I would say this is a really neat site. They have been tracking this data. They actually went back in time. So for each state, basically, you can like hover your little clicker over each country, and it will show you the political rights on these measures uh, all the way back to the founding of the country. And it's pretty neat. And so you can see the U.S. going back until I think it's 1787 when our sort of modern Constitution was signed, all the way up until until sort of contemporary period, and you can actually see us dropping, which is pretty comparable to the rest of the democratic indices that exist out there, like Freedom House. This is VDEM. I think you also have Polity and Polity indices, and they're all saying like the U.S. is collapsing. And for the most part, the world has been moving further toward fewer rights, greater authoritarianism, this sort of thing, right? We've been on sort of a backward trend, which is, a big argument against Fukuyama's idea of the end of history, right? Okay. You also get way less autonomy from the state, right? So political arrests, you see these in Iran, executions for things like drug crimes, which again you see in Iran and Saudi Arabia and others. You get far less sort of diversified economies, right? Because the state is only going to support the ones they want to support in general, right? You get educational controls in a lot of these countries and like big debates at the elite levels about what will be taught and what will not, what can be talked about, what cannot. You get heavy speech and assembly curtailment. And then you get real problems with minority rights, especially women in the region tend to have far fewer rights. Minorities in the region tend to have sort of tenuous rights. Sexual minorities in the region tend to have few to no rights. Um, and then I think, what is it, the next? Oh, no, this is the map. And so, yeah, if you sort of zoom into this map, you can see that the Middle East is troublingly pale, right? there's there's not a lot of sort of human rights in this region until you sort of move westward. Geez. into the Maghreb, right? Okay, what's next? Boom, boom, boom. All right, that was human rights consequences. Next, we're going to talk about. Oh no, we have one more on human rights. Okay, why don't we see human rights develop in these rentier or extractive states, right? A lot of it sort of revolves around accountability to citizens philosophically, and even from a data and observational sense, it's about accountability, right? So you don't really need to use taxes to manage the state. So it severs that connection. You see, I got a misspelled word in here. Payouts and jobs provided by the state in very vast numbers compared to most of the rest of the world tends to sort of reduce your willingness to speak out against the state, right? The lack of diversity in the economy increases the power of the state, like we talked about. You get a lot more greasing of wheels, I guess you would say, with payoffs and bribes and nepotism, especially. And that nepotism piece can become really problematic, right? And the Saudis and Oman and some others have been good about it, but we talked about sort of the disastrous consequences of Maduro putting in just political cronies to lead the oil industries and their overall collapse over the next couple decades. And then I would also say that this gives these states greater international leeway, right? Whereas if you don't really have energy, let's say, to provide to international markets, international institutions and those states that want to sort of signal their human rights stuff um, are willing to get involved, right? If you don't have energy or petroleum or oil or whatever it might be. But if you do have those things, there's a lot more looking the other way about it. And so a really good example happened about, I guess, a decade ago, maybe a little less, where this Saudi citizen, and I think he was also a U.S. citizen who worked for the Washington Post, was lured by Mohammed bin Salman and the Saudis to an Iranian embassy. They murdered him and cut him up and then like melted his body in acid. And at first, the Biden administration was furious. They said, we're not going to deal with Saudis and like we're putting up sanctions. But I mean, it was within like 4 to 6 months that they had completely backed off. They said, okay, now we're going to sell F-15s to the Saudis and we're not going to talk about MBS's human rights abuses. And we don't want anyone to bring up, Jamal Khashoggi anymore. And so, man, these states get away with literal murder, I guess, right? Like I wasn't really going there, but um, yeah, just because of the power that they have and the control that they have, not only internally, but in many senses externally, and our sort of my discipline doesn't talk about that much, which is a little bit troubling, and I think that we should talk a lot more about that. All right. Anyway, that's enough about that. Okay, the next slide. What are the economic consequences? We talked about sort of economic loss, right, and opportunity cost. Every time you make a decision, it has to be compared against the output of all of the decision category that exists, right? And so we get a major lack of diversification because they're just focused on one industry, and because investment floods into that industry because either it's easy money or it is easy to sort of just steal money because the government has given them a go ahead, these sorts of things. Let's see, you also tend to get a lack of human capital. There's really no reason to invest in better training and education and these sorts of things because you don't necessarily even want a diversified economy. We get high levels of control of media, internet, data sets, these sorts of things, which can lead to unpredictability and poor information. And then you often get mass state payouts to the bureaucracy and the statist industries that have been chosen and the militaries, right? And these help to keep loyalty, but they also are purportedly there to be building up the economy. Some states, as we've mentioned, have managed this relatively well. Things were really, really unstable during sort of the petroleum shocks and the OPEC movement in the 1970s. But a handful of these states have become more diversified, have put away sort of these nest eggs, or what do we call them in Texas? We have, man, I should remember the name, but like this special budget that just sits around for emergencies. They've gotten better about that, right? And some have not. Like Iran has not done well. They haven't really kept up with their infrastructure as well as some other countries. Um, Iraq has not necessarily done very well. Of course, they had been just utterly crippled for a while after the Iraq War. Yemen is just a complete nightmare at this point. And Syria might be turning the corner. They got rid of Bashar al-Assad, who was backed by Putin and the Russians. They had a purportedly democratic election for this new guy, and things seem to be getting better. So I'm not ready to just like declare it yet. But things do seem to be improving on the ground in Syria. Okay, now if you look at this map, right, this one looks a lot like the other one that we saw. I think it was in the first section. It's not good to be the black countries on this map, right? Petroleum, oil. This is like the band of political problem countries, right? And so, yeah, you don't really want to be here. Australia, like they have a much more diversified economy, but they do have a massive coal extraction process, usually to send to Vietnam, China, and other countries around them that use a lot of coal. But yeah, you don't want to be in this band. You definitely don't necessarily really want to be a citizen in any of these countries because of this resource curse and the problems with human rights. And then you really don't want to be that little purple one either. That's Afghanistan. And I thought it was funny that I had mentioned earlier this, but yeah, they're the only country who like relies on opium as the largest portion of their economy. So the Taliban, which came in after Biden's disastrous exit, um, has actually been trying to clean some of this up, right? So, like the Taliban is horrifyingly terrible, but this is one thing where they are sort of removing some of the heroin crop. The unfortunate side effect and the negative externality that comes out of this is that like fentanyl has been on the rise as a substitution for heroin. So, not great. Okay. Let's see, the very final slide. This is another problem in the Middle East with developing their economy, and this is a problem in South America too. It's sort of um, some parts of Asia, some parts of Eastern Europe, though they're improving. But this informal economy can be difficult to deal with. Um, I sort of mentioned some of it earlier. There's problems with like purity, right? And how clean are the products and these sorts of things. There's also no way to collect taxes. There's no way to really understand the actual living conditions of a lot of people in the country if there's no real data. So this can be problematic too. The informal workforce, right? And part of this is because like these states have just been unwilling to diversify in some sense. And then part of it goes to sort of culture and tradition and the bazaar and these sorts of things. Um, but yeah, you can see here that some of these countries don't really have data here. But the ones that do are middling at best, right? All right. I think that is it for chapter 8. I'm going to get chapter 10 out tomorrow, and I will also get a new set of slides out for chapter 10. So thanks for being here. I hope you're enjoying the new format. Eventually, I'm going to get the university to pay for a better recording system so I can put the slides up too. But it's a whole bureaucratic thing. I can't just download stuff onto my computer. So anyway, look for that moving forward. All right. Have a great day. Thank you so much.